At the airport gate, a prejudiced passenger, Linda, let loose a torrent of hateful words directed at a black female pilot. Her cutting remarks weren't just offensive. They left everyone around stunned and uneasy. It was a moment that could have escalated into chaos, but what followed next took everyone by surprise. The pilot, poised and composed, didn't yell back. She didn't even let anger cloud her expression. Instead, her response was a silent yet powerful statement that shifted the entire atmosphere. What truly happened on this seemingly ordinary flight? Stay tuned. This story will grip your heart and inspire you deeply. If you enjoy meaningful stories that leave a lasting impact, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the extraordinary moments we have in store. It was a typical morning at JFK Airport, New York. The terminal buzzed with the usual crowd, some sipping coffee, others double-checking boarding passes, while many stood patiently in line, awaiting their flight to Los Angeles. Amid the bustling crowd, a woman named Linda, later identified as the cause of the commotion, was visibly agitated, grumbling about the delay in boarding. As she approached the gate, her eyes suddenly locked onto something, or rather, someone. Standing tall in her crisp pilot's uniform was Captain Grace Walker, a poised and confident black woman greeting passengers with a professional smile. A veteran pilot with over a decade of experience, Grace was highly respected among her peers for her exceptional skills and dedication. But to Linda, none of that seemed to matter. Linda's brow furrowed, her expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief. Her voice, though not loud, carried enough venom to be heard by those nearby. Seriously? A black woman flying the plane? Are they just letting anyone in the cockpit these days? The air around the gate grew heavy. Nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly appalled, while others turned away, unwilling to get involved. Grace heard the remark clearly but chose not to react. This wasn't the first time she had encountered such prejudice. Remaining composed, she continued her duties, her focus unwavering. Meanwhile, Linda stood there, arms crossed, shaking her head in what she deemed righteous disapproval, as if Grace's very presence was an affront to her. Not content to stop there, Linda raised her voice, addressing a nearby airline employee. Is she really the pilot? I don't feel safe with her flying this plane. The employee, maintaining a professional demeanor, replied calmly, Ma'am, Captain Walker is one of our most accomplished pilots. You have nothing to worry about. But Linda was relentless. I don't care how accomplished she is. I'm not flying with her. I want to speak to someone in charge. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of more passengers. A few discreetly pulled out their phones, capturing the unfolding scene. Grace, unshaken, quietly stepped away to complete her pre-flight checks. Her priority was the safety and comfort of her passengers, not engaging with ignorance. Linda, however, escalated her demands. She stormed over to the counter, her tone dripping with indignation. I want to see a manager. I'm not boarding this flight if she's in the cockpit. The airline employee, still courteous but firm, responded, Ma'am, Captain Walker is fully qualified. If you're uncomfortable, we're happy to assist you in rebooking your flight, but we cannot tolerate discriminatory behavior. Linda's face turned crimson with fury as she glanced around, realizing she was the center of attention. A man nearby, unable to stay silent, stood up and addressed her directly. Ma'am, you're out of line. I've flown with Captain Walker before, and she's one of the best pilots out there. The issue here isn't her competency. It's your prejudice. Several passengers nodded in agreement. A woman traveling with 2 young children chimed in. I can't believe people still think like this in today's world. You should be ashamed of yourself. Linda scanned the crowd, now aware of the growing disapproval surrounding her. Despite her embarrassment, she clung to her stance. I don't care what you all think. I'm not flying on this plane. I demand to speak with someone in charge. At that moment, an airline supervisor arrived, having been informed of the situation. Calm yet resolute, he approached Linda and spoke firmly. Ma'am, we are happy to assist you in rebooking your flight. However, we cannot condone this behavior. Captain Walker is the pilot for this flight, and we have full confidence in her abilities. If you're unable to proceed comfortably, we must ask you to leave." Linda, clearly losing her composure, scanned the faces of the passengers around her. Her eyes darted from one disapproving expression to another, but no one stood by her side. Her voice trembled as she pressed on. "I'm going to sue this airline. I'm not getting on this plane unless they replace Grace." The manager, maintaining his calm yet unwavering tone, replied, "Ma'am, we cannot comply with such a request." Realizing she was losing the argument, Linda raised her hand in frustration, her voice sharp and cutting. "Fine, I'll leave, but you'll regret this." With heavy steps and labored breaths, she stormed off, leaving the gathered passengers to sigh in collective relief. The tension that had gripped the boarding area dissipated as Linda disappeared from sight. A few passengers approached Captain Grace, who had maintained her professionalism throughout the ordeal. One man gently patted her shoulder and said, "Thank you for staying calm. We're all behind you." Grace offered a modest smile and nodded in acknowledgement. To her, it was just part of the job, but the support from the passengers touched her more deeply than any accolades ever could. As Grace stepped into the cockpit to prepare for takeoff, the boarding area returned to its usual bustle. Passengers continued to board, and the flight proceeded smoothly, just like any other. By the time the plane ascended into the sky, the drama at the gate had become a distant memory for those on board. Passengers settled into their seats, enjoying the journey. But unbeknownst to Grace, the story was far from over. Some passengers had captured Linda's outburst on video. Before the flight landed in Los Angeles, the footage had gone viral online. The internet erupted in support of Captain Grace, praising her composure and professionalism in the face of such adversity. Grace's story became a symbol of resilience and strength. Her actions that day inspired countless people. As for Linda, she faced a wave of public backlash. Her words and behavior weren't just remembered, they were condemned. She learned a harsh lesson. Discriminatory actions and offensive remarks are never overlooked. Earlier at the gate, Grace had stood silently, observing the entire scene unfold. She did not react to the hateful words hurled her way. Having faced prejudice before, Grace knew how to maintain her composure in such situations. Her priority was ensuring the safety and smooth operation of the flight, not letting emotions take over. Linda, however, had no intention of backing down. She pointed directly at Grace, turning to the crowd and raising her voice. "Let me ask you this. Does anyone here actually feel safe letting her fly this plane?" Her tone, dripping with contempt, cast a heavy silence over the room. Some passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to meet Linda's gaze, while others buried their faces in their phones, pretending not to hear. Breaking the suffocating tension, a middle-aged woman in a sharp business suit stood up from her seat nearby. With a calm yet firm demeanor, she approached Linda and said, "Ma'am." Her voice was resolute. "You need to stop. Captain Walker is an exceptional pilot, and your words are deeply offensive and unacceptable. You're making everyone here uncomfortable." Linda sneered, refusing to relent. "I don't care how any of you feel. What matters is I don't feel safe with her flying this plane." The woman, unyielding, pressed on. "No, that's not the point. Your safety is as important as everyone else's here, and Captain Walker is fully qualified to ensure that. The problem isn't her competence. It's your prejudice." A wave of murmured agreement rippled through the crowd. Some passengers nodded quietly, while others spoke up in support. But Linda, stubborn as ever, only grew louder. She turned back to the gate agent, her tone dripping with entitlement. "I paid a lot of money for this flight, and I demand a pilot I can trust. If this isn't resolved, I will sue this airline." The gate agent, still polite but clearly losing patience, responded firmly, "Ma'am, you are welcome to file a complaint, but please understand we cannot change the pilot based on personal bias. If you feel uncomfortable on this flight, we're happy to assist you in rebooking. However, this behavior is unacceptable." Linda crossed her arms, her face etched with frustration. Fine, I'll rebook, but mark my words, you'll be hearing from my lawyer. As Linda continued to rant, a tall man in a simple t-shirt, who had been silently observing the entire scene, stepped forward. His voice was calm yet resolute as he addressed her. Listen, ma'am, he began, disappointment lacing his tone. The only person making this flight unsafe is you. Captain Walker has flown hundreds of flights without issue. The real problem here is you. Linda spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. This has nothing to do with you. Mind your own business. The man let out a dry chuckle, unfazed by her outburst. Oh, it has everything to do with all of us. We're all on this flight, and no one's going to let your ignorance ruin it for everyone else. By now, more passengers had begun to chime in. Voices supporting the pilot grew louder, drowning out Linda's protests. A woman near the back of the line called out, "The only person out of place here is you. You need to stop and let the rest of us move on." The atmosphere, previously tense, had shifted. Linda, realizing she had no allies, stood frozen, her face a mixture of confusion and defeat. Yet her stubbornness kept her from admitting fault. Feeling cornered, Linda's initial arrogance began to wane. Her eyes darted around the boarding area, searching for someone to back her up, but she found none. Those she had expected to support her were now turning their backs, siding with the growing opposition. She stood there alone, before a crowd that had grown weary of her tirade. Just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point, an airline supervisor arrived. He approached with a calm demeanor, quickly assessing the scene before speaking. "Ma'am," he said firmly but courteously, "we've received multiple complaints about your behavior. I must ask you to step aside so we can discuss this further." Sensing the threat of being forcibly removed, Linda's voice rose, desperate, to retain some semblance of control. "I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. I will not board this flight if she's still the pilot." The supervisor, unflinching, maintained his composure. "We are happy to assist you in rebooking another flight, but your current behavior is unacceptable. We cannot allow it to continue." Linda's face turned crimson with anger as her hands clutched her purse tightly, perhaps to hide the trembling. She stood there, silent for a moment, realizing the power she thought she wielded was slipping away. All that remained were the disappointed gazes of the crowd around her. Captain Grace Walker, in her pristine pilot's uniform, stood tall, observing from a distance. Grace was no stranger to challenges as a black woman in aviation, a field where diversity was still a relatively new concept. With over 15 years of experience and countless commendations for her skill and leadership, she had faced her fair share of prejudice throughout her career. Yet, the overt hostility displayed by Linda was still hard to stomach. Grace had learned to stay composed in situations like this. Her focus remained on the safety and success of the flight, not the ignorance of a single individual. And as the crowd rallied around her, Grace found herself reminded of the resilience required to soar above the clouds, both literally and figuratively. While Grace continued her pre-flight checks, she remained calm, refusing to let the hateful remarks distract her. To her, the safety of the passengers and crew was the highest priority. Linda, on the other hand, grew louder, her words sharper and more venomous with every passing moment. A few crew members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to de-escalate the situation without making it worse. Nearby passengers whispered amongst themselves, their disapproval evident in the glares directed at Linda. Sensing the escalating tension, another supervisor approached Grace and suggested quietly, "Perhaps a few words from you could help diffuse the situation." Grace, as always, maintained her composure under pressure. She nodded in agreement, aware that the chances of reasoning with Linda were slim, but willing to try nonetheless. With her professional demeanor and extensive experience handling difficult situations, Grace approached Linda. The atmosphere felt charged as Grace moved closer, her confident stride and poised demeanor commanding the crowd's attention. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. Linda, in the midst of berating the gate staff, froze momentarily as she noticed Grace nearing. Her eyes widened in surprise before quickly hardening into a glare of fury. "You've got the nerve to come over here?" Linda practically shouted, her voice dripping with disdain. "How am I supposed to trust you to fly this plane? This is an absolute joke." Linda's venomous words cast a heavy silence over the area. Some passengers winced, while others exchanged murmurs of disbelief. Grace, however, was unfazed. She met Linda's fiery gaze with unwavering resolve, her voice calm yet authoritative. "Ma'am," she began, her words deliberate and steady. "I understand you have concerns about this flight. I want to assure you that your safety, and the safety of every passenger on board, is my highest priority." Linda hesitated for a split second, seemingly caught off guard by Grace's measured tone. But she quickly recovered, her voice sharp and accusatory. "You're not qualified to sit in that cockpit. How am I supposed to trust my life to someone like you?" Grace didn't flinch at the harshness of Linda's words. Instead, she responded with professionalism, her voice firm yet respectful. "I have over 15 years of flying experience, thousands of hours in the air, and have passed all rigorous training and certifications. My team and I are fully committed to ensuring a safe and comfortable journey for every passenger." Linda's face turned a deep shade of red as Grace continued speaking. It was clear that Grace's composure was throwing her off balance. Linda had anticipated a heated argument, something to validate her anger, but Grace gave her no such opportunity. Instead of engaging in conflict, Grace presented facts with a calm authority that left little room for rebuttal. For a moment, Linda appeared disoriented, struggling to maintain the intensity of her outrage. She hadn't expected such a poised and respectful response, and the crowd's silent attention only added to her discomfort. Grace's unshakable professionalism, combined with her calm delivery of the truth, began to shift the dynamics. Linda found herself with fewer and fewer arguments to justify her hostility, her fiery resolve starting to falter under the weight of Grace's composed presence. "Say whatever you want," Linda practically screamed, her voice rising with every word. "But I don't trust you. I can't entrust my life to someone like you. People like you shouldn't be in charge of flying a plane. This is too big of a responsibility." Grace's eyes flickered briefly with emotion at the harsh statement, but she quickly regained her composure. Years of dealing with prejudice in her career had taught her how to remain steady in the face of such remarks. She responded calmly, her voice steady yet firm. "I understand that trust is crucial when flying, and I take that responsibility very seriously. However, making assumptions about my abilities based solely on my appearance is unfair and deeply hurtful." Linda sneered, her eyes flashing with disdain. "You think this is about appearances? It's not. This is about experience and skill, things you clearly don't have. I know what a real pilot looks like, and you're not it." Linda's blunt words hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing the space around them. A few passengers gasped audibly, while others discreetly pulled out their phones to record the confrontation. The atmosphere grew thick with tension. Grace didn't waver. She responded, with an even, deliberate tone. "I understand your concerns, ma'am, but I assure you that I am fully capable of ensuring this flight proceeds smoothly. If you're uncomfortable, I recommend discussing alternative arrangements with the airline staff. My priority is the safety and comfort of all passengers, and I cannot allow personal biases to interfere with that goal." Linda's eyes burned with anger. Her fists clenched tightly at her sides, her shoulders trembling as she tried to contain her mounting frustration. She wasn't accustomed to being addressed so calmly yet so authoritatively by someone she openly disrespected. This only fueled her fury. "I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved." Linda spat through gritted teeth, her voice dripping with indignation. The gate agent, who had been watching the exchange with growing tension, finally stepped forward. His tone was soft but resolute. "Ma'am, we've offered you alternative options, but we cannot replace the pilot for this flight. If you continue to disrupt the boarding process, we will have to ask you to leave the flight." Linda turned on him, her rage boiling over. "You think you can throw me off this flight? I'll have all of you fired." This is discrimination. Her accusatory tone, dripping with irony, wasn't lost on the surrounding passengers. A few chuckled quietly at the absurdity, while others shook their heads in exasperation. But Linda remained defiant, determined to get her way. Grace, however, had done her part. She had given Linda the opportunity to address her concerns civilly, but Linda had made her stance abundantly clear. With nothing left to say, Grace gave a small nod to the gate agent before turning away. Her posture remained straight and confident as she walked back toward the cockpit. Returning to her pre-flight checks, Grace shifted her focus to the task that mattered most, ensuring the safety of her passengers and crew. As she walked away, a quiet wave of admiration rippled through the crowd. Many passengers couldn't hide their respect for how Grace had handled the situation. She had remained calm, professional, and unshaken in the face of Linda's venomous words. Those who had initially harbored doubts now felt reassured. They knew they were in the capable hands of a trustworthy pilot. Meanwhile, Linda's fury continued unabated, her high-pitched voice relentlessly spewing accusations. The patience of the other passengers had worn thin. At first, they remained silent, unwilling to get involved. But by now, the tension in the air had reached a breaking point. A man dressed in a sharp suit, seated nearby, rose slowly. His face was a mix of disappointment and frustration. Speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Excuse me, but I've flown with Captain Walker several times, and every flight was flawless. Your words are out of line." His statement cut through Linda's tirade like a sharp blade. She turned to glare at him, but he wasn't finished. Adjusting his tie, he took a step closer to her, his voice calm but weighted with authority. "This isn't about safety. It's about your prejudice. And frankly, I've had enough of it." Linda, caught off guard by his direct confrontation, opened her mouth to retort. But before she could respond, another voice rose from a nearby seat. A young mother, cradling her infant on her lap, stood up. Her eyes shone with determination as she addressed Linda. "I'm flying with my son today," she said firmly, locking eyes with Linda. "And I trust Captain Walker with my child's life. What gives you the right to question her abilities based solely on her skin color? That's not just wrong, it's disgraceful." Her words rippled through the crowd like a wave. Sounds of agreement spread across the waiting area. Heads nodded, and voices joined in, supporting fairness and denouncing Linda's behavior. Linda, now visibly uneasy, darted her eyes around the room, realizing the tide had turned against her. Those she might have expected to support her had chosen otherwise. But the crowd wasn't done yet. Another voice, deep and resolute, emerged from a different corner. This time, it was an older woman, her demeanor calm yet commanding. "I've lived long enough to know that people should be judged not by their appearance but by their abilities," she said firmly. "Captain Walker is more than qualified to pilot this plane, and I, for one, am grateful she's in charge." At this point, the atmosphere in the waiting area had transformed completely. The initial silence and unease were replaced by a powerful sense of unity. Passengers who had remained quiet now stood up, expressing their disapproval of Linda's actions. Toward the back, a group of college students had been recording the entire incident on their phones. One of them stood up, holding their phone aloft. "We've captured everything," he said confidently. "The way you've treated her is unacceptable. And trust me, people are going to see this. You can't say things like that without facing consequences." Linda's confidence began to crumble. Her eyes flickered with panic as she realized how many cameras were pointed at her. She stepped back slightly, her composure faltering. Despite the mounting pressure, Linda stubbornly clung to her stance, her voice shaky but still loud. "This has nothing to do with race. I'm only concerned about my safety, and I have the right to express that." But her words sounded hollow, a weak echo in the charged atmosphere. A man with a thick beard and a baseball cap stepped forward. His gaze was steady, and his tone was brief but powerful. "Your concerns aren't about safety. They're about your prejudice. We all want a safe flight, and we know Captain Walker will ensure that. The only person making this an issue is you." Linda glanced around the gate area, realizing she had lost control of the situation. Passengers who she assumed would remain silent were now standing up, their voices united in defending the pilot she had insulted. Every word from them struck like a hammer against Linda's arrogance, leaving her increasingly isolated and diminished. Suddenly, a young woman seated at the back of the waiting area rose to her feet. She walked forward with determined steps, her steady gaze locked onto Linda. Her voice rang out, clear and resolute, with a strength that cut through the tension. "This is 2024, not 1964. She paused, her tone firm and unwavering. "We no longer tolerate hate like this. Captain Walker has earned her place in that cockpit, and you have no right to question her simply because of her skin color. It's time to leave your prejudice behind and live in the present, like the rest of us." Applause erupted like a wave, loud, powerful, and unified. The sound carried a clear rejection of the racism Linda had tried to spread and a resounding affirmation of support for Captain Grace Walker. The commotion drew the attention of nearby onlookers, including those who hadn't been paying attention before. Linda, who moments ago had stood tall and defiant, now looked bewildered and defeated. Her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger as she scanned the crowd, realizing she was entirely alone. Passengers, airline staff, and even those recording the incident were all united against her. Linda stood there, isolated, visibly out of place and clearly outmatched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Linda exhaled sharply, crossing her arms over her chest and muttering something unintelligible. Her words were too faint to hear, but her attitude spoke volumes of resignation and frustration. Meanwhile, Grace stood not far away, calm and composed. She observed quietly, feeling the warmth of solidarity from those around her. While she hadn't sought anyone's support, the encouragement and applause deeply touched her. Grace gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to her duties, focused on preparing for the flight. As the atmosphere began to settle, the airline supervisor stepped forward. His face was serious but composed. He had been monitoring the situation from a distance, hoping it would resolve itself. But with Linda's relentless defiance and escalating tension, intervention was clearly necessary. He gestured for Linda to step aside for a private conversation. She reluctantly followed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was flushed, her eyes flashing with defiance, as if she still believed she was in the right. But the supervisor's stern expression made it clear that the outcome would not be in her favor. "Ma'am," the supervisor began, his tone calm but firm, "we've been made aware of your concerns regarding the pilot of this flight. However, let me be clear. Your behavior is unacceptable, and we do not tolerate any form of discrimination. Your remarks toward Captain Walker have crossed a line." Linda's face twisted with anger. She pointed toward Grace, who was now near the cockpit, calmly completing her final pre-flight checks. "You really think I should just ignore the fact that she's flying this plane?" Linda shouted, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm not the problem here. I have the right to feel safe, and I do not feel safe." Her words hung in the air, but no one responded. The surrounding passengers stared at her with cold, disapproving eyes, their silence louder than any rebuttal. It was clear that no one was willing to entertain Linda's stubborn ignorance any longer. Here's the translated and edited version in English, keeping the emotional depth and professionalism intact. The supervisor's gaze narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Captain Walker is not only qualified to command this flight, but she is also one of our most outstanding pilots, with an impeccable track record. Your issue here isn't about her competence. It's about your prejudice. We cannot allow that to disrupt this flight or inconvenience other passengers." Linda let out a scornful laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Prejudice? You think I'm prejudiced because I'm concerned for my safety? That's ridiculous. I'm the customer. I have the right to demand a qualified pilot." The supervisor sighed, recognizing that Linda would not back down easily. His tone shifted, becoming firmer yet still polite. "Ma'am, you absolutely have the right to fly with a qualified pilot, and Captain Walker meets every qualification. She has earned her position through years of hard work and dedication. Now, I'm going to give you two options. His voice lowered slightly, emphasizing the seriousness of the moment. You can board the plane and respect the crew, or we will have to ask you to leave the flight. Linda's face turned crimson, her furious eyes boring into the supervisor. Ask me to leave the plane? You can't do that. I'll sue this airline into oblivion. You'll all lose your jobs because of me. The threat didn't faze the supervisor. His voice remained steady. I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am, but our policies are clear. We do not tolerate discriminatory behavior or harassment. If you continue to disrupt the boarding process and disrespect the crew, we will have no choice but to remove you from the flight. Linda glanced around, her eyes darting toward the passengers watching the scene unfold. Many were shaking their heads in disapproval, while others muttered their frustration. The pressure from the crowd was palpable, and she could feel it closing in. Still, Linda wasn't ready to concede. You'll regret this, Linda muttered, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. She began to realize she wasn't just arguing with a gate agent. She was risking being banned from the flight entirely. The thought of missing her trip made her hesitate. Meanwhile, Captain Grace remained focused on her work in the cockpit, undistracted by the chaos nearby. She trusted the team to handle the situation and kept her attention on the priority at hand, ensuring the flight departed safely and on time. Grace refused to let outbursts like Linda's divert her from her responsibilities. At the gate, the supervisor recognized the need to resolve the situation swiftly before passenger frustrations escalated further. He fixed his gaze on Linda and said firmly, "Ma'am, we need to complete the boarding process. Please make your decision now. Either you board the plane and follow the rules, or we will proceed without you." Linda stood there, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes flickering with indecision. She could feel the judgmental stares of other passengers, their silent condemnation weighing heavily on her. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her pride against the reality of being removed from the flight. Finally, with a loud huff of frustration, Linda threw her hands in the air and snapped, "Fine, I'll get on the plane, but don't think for a second that this is over." The supervisor gave a curt nod, his tone icy yet courteous. "Thank you for your cooperation. Please board the plane now." Linda stomped past him, her footsteps heavy with anger, though it was clear she had no other choice. As she joined the boarding line, passengers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, while others smirked quietly. A wave of relief swept through the area, as if everyone had finally weathered an unpleasant storm. The tension lingered as Linda handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. Before stepping forward, she shot a glare toward the cockpit, where Captain Grace was standing, her eyes burning with fury. The agent quickly scanned the ticket. A short beep sounded, and Linda stormed through the jet bridge, her rigid posture radiating frustration. The supervisor, after ensuring everything was back on track, returned to his post, allowing the boarding process to continue without further disruption. The tense atmosphere at the gate slowly dissipated as the remaining passengers lined up, relieved that the ordeal seemed to be over. But on board the plane, Linda wasn't ready to concede defeat. The anger inside her simmered like an ember refusing to extinguish. Suddenly, she stopped in her tracks. Under the stunned gaze of passengers, she turned abruptly and marched back toward the gate agent. Her voice cut through the air, louder and sharper than before. "I am not flying with her." She pointed directly at Captain Grace, who was in the cockpit performing pre-flight checks. The passengers, who had just begun to relax, now turned their heads in disbelief. The air, which had just cleared, grew heavy once more. Linda's face was flushed red as she raised her voice, demanding, "Either get me another pilot or put me on a different flight. I am not stepping onto that plane if she's in the cockpit." The gate agent, visibly exhausted from the ongoing drama, sighed heavily before responding. "Ma'am, as I've explained before, Captain Walker is an exceptionally experienced pilot. There are no other flights available, and we will not replace the pilot. You have two options. Either board the plane, or make your own travel arrangements at your own expense. Linda narrowed her eyes at the gate agent, her expression a mix of disbelief and indignation. She had expected her demands to be met, but instead, she was met with an unyielding refusal. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "This is unacceptable. I'm the customer, and I have the right to feel safe." The gate agent, maintaining her composure but clearly nearing the end of her patience, replied firmly, "You've already spoken with our supervisor. Let me reiterate, your safety is not at risk. Captain Walker has flown thousands of flights and is fully qualified to ensure a safe journey. Now, please decide, board the plane or leave the gate area." The agent's unwavering tone left no room for further argument. Linda's face contorted with rage, but it was clear she was running out of options. Around her, the passengers grew visibly more irritated. Some shook their heads in frustration, others whispered to one another, and a few raised their phones to capture the seemingly endless spectacle. Cornered, Linda made one last attempt. Pointing a trembling finger toward the cockpit, her voice rose, venomous and cutting. "This is all her fault," she shouted, loud enough for everyone at the gate to hear. "She doesn't deserve to be a pilot, and she knows it." Her hateful words hung in the air, but instead of sympathy, she was met with shocked and disgusted stares. The entire gate area fell silent, punctuated only by weary sighs from the passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Grace remained as composed as ever. She didn't waver, her focus entirely on the controls and final checklists. Her hands moved deftly across the panels with precision and confidence, unbothered by the chaos behind her. Grace knew that staying calm in such moments was key, and she wouldn't let Linda's hateful outbursts distract her from her responsibilities. Back at the gate, the agent's patience had finally worn thin. She stepped forward, her voice firm and decisive. "Ma'am, I must ask you to leave the area. We do not tolerate this kind of behavior. Security is on their way to escort you out." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't kick me out," she yelled furiously. "I'm a customer. I have rights." But it was too late. The airline staff had already called security. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the gate. Linda's face paled slightly at the sight of them, but her stubbornness held firm. "I'm not leaving until I get what I want," Linda hissed through clenched teeth. The security officers, however, had no intention of negotiating. One of them spoke in a calm but authoritative voice. "Ma'am, you've been asked to leave. Please gather your belongings and come with us." Linda's defiance flared once more. "No, I'm not going anywhere. You can't force me," she shouted, her voice growing louder as if trying to assert her determination. The 2 officers stepped closer, their demeanor making it clear they were prepared to act if necessary. Outnumbered and overpowered, Linda finally relented. She bent down to pick up her bag from the floor, her movements stiff with frustration, muttering angry words under her breath. Before leaving, she spun around one last time, her voice shrill. "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Her threats didn't faze anyone. The security officers remained composed as they escorted her out of the area. As Linda walked away, her face flushed with embarrassment, a heavy silence hung over the waiting area. Then, unexpectedly, a smattering of applause broke out. At first, it was just a few claps here and there, but it quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. The sound echoed through the terminal, a clear statement of unity and support for Captain Grace and the airline's handling of the situation. Linda, now red-faced and humiliated, quickened her pace, avoiding the judgmental stares of those around her. Her hurried footsteps soon faded from view, leaving behind a wave of relief. She had come to the gate intending to humiliate Captain Grace, but in the end, it was Linda who left in disgrace. As the applause subsided, passengers exchanged knowing smiles and relieved glances. Some even gave thumbs up to the airline staff, silently thanking them for resolving the ordeal. In the cockpit, Captain Grace observed from a distance. She hadn't asked for praise or attention, but the passengers' solidarity didn't go unnoticed. Taking a deep breath, she returned her focus to the task at hand, ensuring a safe flight for everyone aboard. The gate staff quickly resumed their work, allowing the remaining passengers to board without further incident. As they passed the cockpit, a few stopped briefly to offer quiet words of encouragement. "Thank you for handling everything so gracefully." Grace smiled softly, nodding in acknowledgement, her usual calm and humility intact. Once the final passenger was seated, the morning chaos felt like a distant memory. Captain Grace settled into her seat, her eyes scanning the controls one last time before preparing for takeoff. As the plane taxied down the runway, every passenger on board knew they were in the hands of an exceptional pilot, despite Linda's futile attempts to disrupt the journey. As passengers boarded the plane and settled into their seats, a sense of calm filled the cabin. The earlier commotion now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet solidarity and pride. A few passengers exchanged knowing glances, their faint smiles reflecting gratitude that the situation had been resolved with dignity. Captain Grace, having completed her pre-flight checks, stepped out of the cockpit for one final walkthrough before takeoff. Her composed and confident demeanor not only reassured everyone on board, but also earned their deep respect. As Grace made her way down the aisle for a final inspection, an elderly woman seated near the front raised a hand, gesturing for Grace to come closer. Her eyes radiated warmth and gratitude as she gently touched Grace's hand. "Captain," the woman said in a steady, heartfelt tone, "today, you stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us. Thank you for your calm and courage." Grace's expression softened, and a modest smile crossed her face. "Thank you," she replied humbly. "My duty is to ensure everyone has a safe and smooth flight. It's an honor to serve you." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with admiration as Grace returned to the cockpit. Other passengers whispered their thanks, some offering encouraging smiles, while others simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement. It was clear to everyone that Grace had proven herself not only as a skilled pilot, but also as a leader of remarkable grace and strength in the face of adversity. Back in the cockpit, Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself for the journey ahead. Though she had flown this route countless times before, today felt different. The confrontation earlier wasn't a burden. It served as a reminder of why she had worked tirelessly to earn her place in the captain's seat. Her co-pilot, a young man with an air of admiration in his gaze, gave her a respectful nod as she settled into her chair. "Ready for takeoff, Captain?" he asked, his tone both serious and supportive. Adjusting her headset and focusing on the controls, Grace replied confidently, "Let's do it. We're getting everyone to Los Angeles safely." As Grace communicated with air traffic control, her steady voice filled the cabin through the intercom, guiding the plane smoothly onto the runway. In the cabin, passengers fastened their seatbelts and settled into their seats. The air was now filled with a sense of relief and tranquility. Faces that had been strangers mere hours ago now seemed familiar, as if they had been united by the shared experience of standing against injustice. The engines roared as the plane accelerated down the runway, and soon, it lifted gracefully into the sky. As New York City shrank beneath them, passengers let go of their earlier worries, embracing the sense of a fresh start. Grace sat in the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls. Despite facing turbulence both on the ground and in the air, she remained unwavering. Flying had always been her greatest passion, and today was no different. The challenges she faced didn't weaken her resolve. They only strengthened it. The weather during the flight was perfect. Passengers relaxed in their seats, some watching movies, others engrossed in books or gazing out the window at the expansive sky. Yet beneath this seemingly ordinary flight, everyone felt they had witnessed something extraordinary. Captain Grace had done more than transport them from one city to another. She had shown them the true meaning of resilience and the power of rising above prejudice and hate. A young passenger sitting mid-cabin quietly observed the people around her. Taking in the now peaceful atmosphere, she pulled out her phone and began typing a message to her friends. She described how Captain Grace had handled the situation at the gate with extraordinary calm and professionalism, It's not every day you witness someone standing up for themselves with such composure and grace. I feel lucky to be on this flight. As the flight progressed, the flight attendants moved down the aisle with carts, serving snacks and drinks. Many passengers took this opportunity to thank the crew, expressing admiration for their professionalism and composure in handling Linda's behavior. Like Grace, the crew remained focused on their duties, ensuring the safety and comfort of everyone on board without letting the incident disrupt their mission. Time passed, and the plane neared its destination. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows and painting the sky in shades of gold. As the Los Angeles skyline came into view, passengers adjusted their seatbelts, preparing for landing. Captain Grace's voice came over the intercom, steady and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. I want to thank you all for your patience and support today. It has been an honor to serve you. We'll be landing shortly, so please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Thank you for flying with us." Passengers exchanged knowing looks, a few offering soft smiles. Grace's words, though brief, carried a deeper meaning. This wasn't just a flight. It was a lesson in courage and steadfastness in the face of adversity. As the plane touched down gently on the runway, a quiet round of applause rippled through the cabin. It wasn't the raucous cheering that often follows a turbulent landing, but a gesture of respect, a silent thank you to Grace and the journey they had shared. When the plane taxied to the gate and passengers began to disembark, there was a sense of closure in the air. The day, which had begun with division and hostility, ended with unity and respect. Many passengers stepped off the plane feeling that this journey would remain a lasting memory. But the story didn't end at the airport. While Linda departed in humiliation and anger, the repercussions of her actions were already unfolding. Some passengers had discreetly recorded the confrontation at the gate, Linda's loud, offensive remarks juxtaposed against Captain Grace's calm and composed responses. The videos quickly made their way to social media as soon as the plane landed. One clip, in particular, showing Linda shouting at the gate agent and pointing aggressively toward Grace, went viral with the caption, "When a racist Linda meets the wrong one today, watch how Captain Grace handles it with class." Within hours, the post garnered thousands of comments from around the world. Many praised Grace's professionalism, while others expressed outrage at Linda's behavior. Hashtags like #FlyingWithGrace and #NoToRacism began trending, accompanied by personal stories of individuals standing up against prejudice in public spaces. The story didn't just spread on social media, it caught the attention of mainstream media as well. Clips of Linda's behavior and Grace's calm demeanor were featured on major news networks with headlines such as "Black female pilot faces racism with poise and strength," and "Calm response to hatred by female pilot sparks global support." The incident quickly became a national topic of discussion, sparking debates about discrimination in the aviation industry and the importance of diversity in professional fields like aviation. Many passengers recounted the event from their own perspectives, highlighting the discomfort caused by Linda's hateful remarks and their pride in how Captain Grace handled the situation. Grace could have easily lost her composure, but she didn't, one passenger shared in a televised interview. She handled everything with incredible class and professionalism. "We need more people like her." Captain Grace's name quickly appeared across social media platforms, accompanied by waves of support and admiration. She became the center of attention overnight, not in the way she might have hoped, but because of her resilience and dignity in the face of hostility. Despite the newfound attention, Grace's humble nature meant she wasn't seeking fame or recognition. In the days following the incident, she continued her work with the same dedication she had shown throughout her career. However, the overwhelming support was impossible to ignore. Grace's inbox overflowed with messages from around the world, from fellow pilots, young girls aspiring to become pilots, and ordinary people inspired by her actions. One message came from a young black girl with dreams of flying. "Seeing what happened gave me hope that I can do anything. Thank you for showing me that strength isn't always about fighting. It's about being yourself." Grace felt her heart swell as she read the words. She realized that what had happened wasn't just about her. It was about the thousands of others facing similar challenges. Her actions, though unintentional, had inspired countless people to hold their heads high and overcome obstacles. The airline also responded swiftly to the widespread attention. Within a day of the video going viral, they released an official statement about the incident. In it, they commended Captain Grace for her professionalism and expressed pride in how she handled the situation. "We stand by Captain Walker and thank her for upholding our company's values of inclusion, respect, and integrity. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination and are committed to ensuring our passengers and crew feel safe and respected." The airline's decisive and supportive response only amplified public support for Grace. Hashtags like #SupportGrace and #FlyWithPride began trending on social media. People posted photos from airports and flights, using these hashtags to show solidarity with Grace and the airline. In the days that followed, television networks repeatedly invited Grace to share her story. Initially hesitant to step into the spotlight, she eventually agreed to participate in a few interviews, viewing them as an opportunity to spread a positive message. In each interview, Grace spoke candidly about the incident, but consistently redirected the conversation to a broader issue: how to confront discrimination in everyday life. "This wasn't just about me," Grace said during a televised interview. "It was about standing up for what's right and for everyone who has ever felt overlooked or disrespected for being who they are. We can't control how others treat us, but we can control how we respond. Sometimes, the best response is to stay calm and focus on what truly matters." Grace's words resonated deeply with countless people. Her story spread far beyond social media, reaching classrooms, workplaces, and family discussions. Grace was no longer just a pilot. She became a symbol of strength and resilience. Even as the news cycle moved on to other stories, the impact of that day endured. Social media users continued to share the video, discussing how Grace had stood tall against Linda's hatred. For many, she became an inspiration, a testament to how composure and dignity in the face of adversity can be a powerful force for change. Linda, on the other hand, couldn't escape the intense backlash. While Grace's reputation soared, Linda found herself at the center of widespread condemnation. Captain Grace was celebrated not just for her exceptional skills as a pilot but for her leadership qualities, an example of rising above hatred and ignorance with grace. What Linda had intended to demean Grace instead backfired spectacularly. In her attempt to tear someone down, she inadvertently elevated Grace, inspiring countless individuals who saw their own struggles and triumphs reflected in Grace's journey. As Captain Walker's name dominated headlines, Linda's world fell apart. The viral video didn't just expose her racist remarks. It placed her entire life under intense scrutiny. Within days, internet users identified her, and waves of criticism poured in from across the globe, demanding accountability for her behavior. Initially, Linda chose to remain silent, hoping the storm would pass. But as days went by, the outrage only grew louder. Social media platforms were flooded with discussions about the incident, and soon, journalists began delving into her personal life. Linda's workplace learned about the situation and launched an internal investigation to determine whether her actions aligned with the company's values. Colleagues who had once worked alongside her began distancing themselves, worried about being associated with her actions. Under mounting pressure, Linda was forced to issue a public apology. In a carefully crafted statement, she expressed regret for her offensive and inappropriate comments, claiming she had acted out of anger and that her behavior didn't reflect who she truly was. However, for many, the apology felt hollow. The damage had been done, and her words came too late to repair the harm she had caused. Linda's personal and professional life unraveled rapidly. Her once pristine reputation was now irreparably tarnished. Friends, family, and even neighbors began treating her differently, and Linda found herself ostracized within her own community. In stark contrast, Captain Grace continued to shine. Although she never sought fame, her story of patience and professionalism touched the hearts of millions. Interviews from major media outlets poured in. Yet Grace, ever humble, chose to focus on her work rather than bask in the limelight. In every interview she participated in, She skillfully redirected the conversation to a broader issue, the need to combat discrimination in daily life. "This wasn't just about me," Grace shared during a television program. "It was about standing up for what's right and defending those who have ever felt overlooked or disrespected simply for being who they are. We can't control how others treat us, but we can control how we respond. Sometimes, the best response is to stay calm and focus on what truly matters." Grace's words resonated deeply with audiences. Her story was shared in classrooms, workplaces, and family conversations, serving as a powerful lesson in strength and resilience. Grace became more than a pilot. She became a symbol of courage and perseverance. While public attention gradually shifted to other stories, the impact of that day continued to echo. Social media users kept sharing the video, praising Grace's composure in the face of Linda's hateful remarks. For many, Grace became an inspiration, a testament that calmness and dignity can transform adversity into a powerful force for change. Linda, meanwhile, faded from the public eye. Her threats of legal action never materialized. But the consequences of her actions would forever remain a bitter reminder of the damage prejudice and hatred can inflict, not just on others, but on oneself. Through her own hateful behavior, Linda diminished herself in the eyes of the world. In stark contrast, Captain Walker soared higher, not only in her career but also in the hearts of those who admired her. Grace's story transcended the confrontation with racism. It became a shining example of grace under pressure, proving that professionalism and respect will always triumph over hate. Grace's journey became a beacon of hope, reminding people everywhere that no matter how daunting the challenges may seem, how you confront them ultimately defines who you are. Grace showed the world that true strength comes from within, and the best way to rise above adversity is to stay true to your values. As the story of Captain Walker and Linda came to a close, one thing was clear: Grace's legacy would endure, not just because of what happened at the airport that day, but because of how she faced it with dignity and poise. For anyone who has ever faced discrimination or hatred, Grace's story stands as a powerful reminder that, no matter how dark the moment may feel, dignity and professionalism will always shine through. Today's story reminds us of the power of composure, self-respect, and the ability to rise above prejudice. If you were in Captain Walker's position, how would you have handled this situation? Have you ever stood up for what's right in the face of injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire and empower others. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of respect and resilience. Thank you for watching and supporting us. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next heartfelt and inspiring story. Together, let's create a world where everyone is valued and treated with fairness. Wishing you health, happiness, and success. ***.